Hello and thanks for joining us from our studios in Israel. Coming up in today's newscast, the Israeli coalition almost falls apart after a major transportation dispute. Israel mourns the death of the father of a fallen Israeli soldier, and the IDF develops a groundbreaking new training program to prevent excessive force. I'm Natasha Kirchak here with the latest news in Israel. It's always difficult to go back to work after the weekend, but Israelis started off the work week with an extra headache. After a major political dispute led the prime minister to close down train repairs on the Sabbath, the majority of the country was stuck in a big gridlock this morning. At least 150,000 commuters were impacted by havoc on the roads this morning, including thousands of soldiers trying to make their way back to base after weekend leave. The cancellation of 150 trains between Tel Aviv and Haifa led a lot of desperate travelers to jump into their cars instead, which in turn caused bumper-to-bumper traffic on many of the nation's busiest highways. The disruption comes amid protests from the Orthodox Shas and United Torah Judaism parties against recent repair work on Tel Aviv rail lines, because religious Jews oppose any work on the Sabbath. Netanyahu is accusing Transportation Minister Israel Katz of deliberately sparking the crisis for political gain.
משרד התחבורה מפעיל מערך אוטובוסים מתוגבר כדי להקל על תנועת הנוסעים. המשבר הזה כולו מיותר. לא היה צורך להגיע למצב הזה. יש במדינת ישראל סטטוס קוו מזה שנים רבות, אנחנו מכבדים אותו. כשצריך לבצע עבודות בשבת, הן מתבצעות, כפי שהיה בשבת שעברה, בנתיבי איילון. כשלא צריך עבודות בשבת, הן לא יתבצעו. זה הכלל שהנחה אותנו, זה הכלל שימשיך להנחות אותנו.
According to the Prime Minister, Katz ordered the unnecessary weekend construction to intentionally undermine the premier's relationship with the ultra-Orthodox and the general public. The whole incident comes just a few weeks after the two leaders, who both belong to Likud, competed for control of a key party institution. This past Friday, Netanyahu suddenly froze all planned repairs on 17 out of 20 sites on the rail system. And there wasn't enough time for crews to fix already disassembled parts of the track, which caused this morning's problem. Netanyahu ordered alternative transportation for soldiers and an increased number of bus lines in Tel Aviv and Haifa to alleviate delays by the suspended rail service.
כשלא רוצים משבר, ניתן להימנע ממנו. אני מצפה בעניין הזה לשיתוף פעולה מלא מצד כל השרים. שרים מתמנים כדי למנוע משברים, לפתור בעיות, לא לייצר אותם.
What may seem like a political power struggle between Likud leaders brought up a core debate in the Israeli society over the ancient status quo agreement between the religious authorities and the Israeli government. The Israeli left-wing parties organized and led demonstrations against the closures in both Haifa and Tel Aviv last night, with several hundred frustrated commuters participating. The head of the left-wing Meretz party, Anat Belko, also petitioned the High Court over Netanyahu's decision. Many are convinced that the entire train crisis is just a political attempt to bash the prime minister both within and outside of the Likud party. Similar attempts to oust Netanyahu were made by former defense minister Moshe Yaalon, who is now no longer a part of the government. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz sat down with Jerusalem Post editor Yaakov Katz to hear about how Yaalon may be making a comeback with plans to become the next prime minister.
You wrote an interesting column called The Man Who Could Beat Netanyahu, Ready to Challenge Bibi, and you were talking about former Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon. Why do you think Moshe Yaalon could beat Netanyahu?
I think Yaalon has the credentials when it comes to security. He is a former IDF Chief of Staff, a former Defense Minister, and he could contend and compete with Netanyahu, who also presents himself to the Israeli electorate as Mr. Security. So he has that. He also comes from the right wing. He's very right wing, and the Israeli electorate has moved to the right in recent years. So they're looking for a leader of the right, and I think my prediction would be is that the left does not have a leader right now. They don't have the party that can really compete and win an election against Netanyahu, but someone from the right has that potential. Yaalon could be that candidate.
Netanyahu is still the prime minister. We're not certain what his plans are for the future. If he leaves the Likud, do you see Yaalon forming a different party or trying to take over the leadership within Likud?
So in the meantime, since he's left the defense ministry just a couple months ago, he's already formed a new NGO called Alternative Leadership, which he's using kind of as a platform that he can go around, give lectures, speak to people, meet different demographics in different sectors of Israeli society, raise some funds, and that could be converted, if the day comes, into a political platform and into a party that he can then run on that ticket in the next elections. My prediction, though, would be that if Netanyahu decides not to run for a fifth term and to step down, resign, go home, and make money, let's say, then Yaalon would potentially run for the chairmanship of the Likud party. It would be possibly a bloodbath inside the Likud the day after Netanyahu, because a lot of people would be vying for that top spot. But yet Yaalon would be one of the natural candidates to run for there. So I think it's too early to tell what will happen, but I would say that if Netanyahu decides to run in the next election for another term, Yaalon will definitely run at the head of a new party, possibly connected to an existing politician. Could be Naftali Bennett from Bayit Yehudi, could be Moshe Yaalon from Kulanu. We could see a mix and different combinations and alliances and partnerships that today don't seem possible, but at the time, when those elections come, might be viable, because a lot of these people have one objective in mind, and that is to dethrone Benjamin Netanyahu, to get him to lose the premiership and to replace him. So it could be that people who thought that they would be the prime minister are willing to step to number two in their party to allow someone else, and if that alliance works, to get Netanyahu out.
In the months before he left office as defense minister, Yaalon was actually coming under quite a bit of criticism from within his own Likud party because of certain things that he had said and done. Do you think that he still would have the political support to become leader of Likud?
I think so. I think that he has, he's on the right, if you recall, and you're referring to comments that he made in defense of the deputy chief of staff, who made some controversial remarks around the Holocaust Remembrance Day and around the Hebron shooting incident. He came out and defended the IDF decision to launch a criminal investigation, while a lot of the right-wing political map defended the Hebron shooter, that soldier, Elor Azaria. So he did come under criticism, but I think that there's a very simple way to know whether he's right or not. Netanyahu, for example, has embraced the two-state solution, gave that famous Bar Ilan speech where he said, I want to establish a Palestinian state. Yaalon has been opposed to that, has been against a Palestinian state for a number of years. So he definitely is a hawk. He's definitely on the right. He has the credentials. He's been in favor of settlements. He's been a darling of the settlement movement.
Is he a good enough politician?
That's the question. Is he a good enough politician, and does he know how to get his hands dirty in politics? Because when you're chief of staff and you get parachuted into a political party, you're something of a celebrity, you're a star, you don't have to get your hands dirty. He doesn't have that stardust anymore. He will have to get his hands dirty. And as we all know, politics is a dirty business, a lot of backstabbing, a lot of handling, a lot of negotiating in back channels and under the table and behind closed doors. I don't know if Yaalon knows how to do that. This will be the real test of his capability as a politician and as a leader, if he can create that type of political animal that you need to be able to become prime minister in Israel.
Yaakov Katz, thanks so much for being with us at ILTV.
Thank you.
Over the weekend, a devastating explosion dealt a fatal blow to Israel's aerospace industry. A rocket launch pad burst into flames in Florida, destroying the famous Israeli-built and owned Amos 6, Israel's largest ever satellite. It turns out the satellite wasn't the only thing to burst into flames, so was Facebook's plan to use it to beam high-speed internet to sub-Saharan Africa. Video shows a fury blast ripping through the upper part of the Falcon 9 rocket and a communications satellite, owned by the Israeli SpaceX company. The accident occurred during a routine test just 2 days before the Amos 6 satellite and its cargo were supposed to lift off into orbit. There were no injuries. 3,000 channels of computer and video data covering just 35 to 55 milliseconds are now being scoured by investigators from the company, which is owned by Israeli billionaire Elon Musk. It appears that a malfunction is likely to have originated somewhere near the liquid oxygen tank in the upper stage. Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, who was hoping to use a satellite to boost connectivity to Africa, expressed deep disappointment but says he remains committed to the mission. Even though company shares took a hit in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, SpaceX is likely to rebound soon. It has 2 other pads and 70 other launches worth more than $10 billion already lined up. Not to mention, its other major client, NASA, relies on the Israeli company to not only send supplies to its space station, but wants it to start transporting crew in order to reduce U.S. reliance on Russian rockets. Musk founded SpaceX back in 2002, by the way, with the goal of making travel to Mars more affordable. Next month, the Israeli entrepreneur is set to unveil details of the company's plans to fly its first unmanned spacecraft to the Red Planet in 2018. And the company may even send humans to Mars as early as 2024. Israel spent the weekend mourning the tragic death of the father of a fallen Israeli soldier. Herzl Shaul succumbed to cancer on Friday after fighting for years to get his son Oron's body back from Hamas since the 2014 war in Gaza. Military officials and politicians paid tribute to Herzl Shaul, who passed away from cancer of the small intestine just 2 years after his son Oron was murdered in Gaza City. Shaul had been gallantly undergoing chemotherapy as he fought to get Hamas to return his son's body from the Gaza Strip. Oron Shaul was killed with 6 other Golani soldiers after an attack on their armored personnel carrier. The 20-year-old was declared missing, and at the time, Hamas claimed that they were holding him. But it was later discovered that he was no longer alive. Since then, the terror group has claimed that they are holding his body, and Oron's family has fought to get his remains returned to Israel. Oron's father Herzl was diagnosed with cancer just 1 year after his son fell in battle, but despite his debilitating illness, he fought until his last day on earth to bring Oron home. The Shaul family says Herzl passed away at around 3 p.m. on a Friday, about the same time in which they learned Oron was no longer alive just 2 years before. The state of Israel has promised to do everything possible to fulfill Herzl's wishes and bring Oron's body back to the Holy Land.
היום יובא למנוחות הרצל שאול, אביו של חלל צה"ל אורון שאול, זיכרונו לברכה. גופתו של אורון, יחד עם גופתו של הדר גולדין, מוחזקת על ידי ארגון החמאס, ארגון טרור אכזרי שלא מכבד שום נורמה הומניטרית. הרצל שאול היה אדם אמיץ, ועד ימיו האחרונים הוא נאבק כדי להשיב את גופת בנו לקבר ישראל. במקביל, בשנה האחרונה הוא נאלץ להיאבק במחלת הסרטן שפקדה אותו. אני ראיתי אותו כמה וכמה פעמים, וכל פעם מפגש למפגש ראיתי אותו נעשה כחוש יותר, ועומד באמת בגבורה בטרגדיה הכפולה שפקדה אותו ואת משפחתו. בשם הממשלה והעם בישראל אני מבקש לשלוח תנחומים לרעייתו היקרה זהבה ולבנים אבירם ואפק. אנחנו נמשיך לפעול בכל המישורים כדי להחזיר לקבר ישראל את הדר גולדין ואת אורון שאול, זיכרונם לברכה.
The Israeli army is on a mission to prevent as much bloodshed as possible when it comes to dealing with terror attacks, even if that means protecting the lives of the attackers themselves. The IDF has just rolled out a new training program that's focused on teaching soldiers how to respond to terrorists with non-lethal measures. The new training program was released in response to the months-long wave of Palestinian terror attacks that began last October, in which many young Palestinian assailants were killed by Israeli security forces while carrying out attacks. Senior defense officials have criticized the use of excessive force in subduing Palestinian attackers, and now the Israeli army is striving to connect training with what's happening on the ground. Israeli soldiers are being taught various Krav Maga techniques used to neutralize attackers without using their weapons, all in an effort to avoid additional bloodshed. Last November, 2 Palestinian teenagers armed with scissors stabbed and lately wounded an elderly man in Jerusalem, and an off-duty officer ended up opening fire on the 2 girls in response. The 16-year-old was killed and the 14-year-old was critically wounded, and the guard was later investigated for using excessive force. IDF Chief Gadi Eisenkot has warned soldiers of being trigger-happy when faced by attackers, even if they feel threatened. Although the army chief claims that Israel's rules of engagement punishment are as moral as possible. Israeli leaders have continued to stress that Israeli soldiers should only shoot terrorists if they pose an immediate threat to human life. The most recent wave of Palestinian terrorism began last October, and a series of gun knife and car ramming attacks have taken the lives of 34 innocent civilians. 220 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli security forces, the majority of whom were carrying out attacks. The IDF hopes to lower these numbers by re-educating soldiers about responding to terrorism. In a week, the world will be marking one of the deadliest terror attacks known to humanity, 9/11. Today, international terror continues to threaten innocent lives across the globe, and not just in Israel. Joining us in the studio today is terror expert and Knesset member Dr. Anat Belko, whose latest book, The Smarter Bomb, studies what draws women and children to terror. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Natasha.
So to begin, tell us about this book. It just came out in its newest form, and it's gotten a lot of praise from the Israeli Prime Minister, even from Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, I'm very proud of that, because I wrote this book almost 6 years ago. It was published 4 years ago in America, and the publisher asked me, they told me, you predict so many things, so we would like you just to update the final words and to publish it in soft cover. So it will come very soon. In 2 weeks, it will be, in Amazon, it's already there. And I think that what we see right now, it's a wave, a tsunami of minors involved in terrorism. Actually, from my point of view, also mass raping is terrorism. It's a form of terrorism.
Absolutely.
And we see more women involved in terrorism that push to the corner and try to stab soldiers or other things that we saw. And we see that the world is in danger. The September 11 event was not so many years ago, but people in America forgot that and think that it was just one time and that's it. And I can say that few months ago, there was a guy in the Metro Center, a junction worker there, that he also tried to carry out a terror attack there. And there was a cell of terrorism. And I'm thinking about myself, when I was living in DC, when I was a visiting professor at GW, taking the metro to Foggy Bottom station through the Metro Center station, I cannot think about what could happen there and the blast and the casualties, and so it's very dangerous. We're not speaking just about high towers like September 11, but metro stations, and we saw things like that, malls, shops, restaurants. We see what's happening in France, and I think, and not in Europe in general, that people, shouting at the street, Allahu Akbar, and shooting or stabbing and slaughtering people. And I think that we faced a tsunami of terrorism, and as I defined it in the Knesset, first day in the Knesset, a year and a half ago, I said it's a World War III, and we should be able to cope and to defeat it.
Now let's talk a little bit more about your focus on children and women, more specifically adolescents. 50% of the recent terror attacks here in Israel were carried out by adolescents. Why is that the case?
One time Hamas terrorist told me in jail when I interviewed him, the children are the small change. You can use them. Sometimes they are not effective because they don't kill enough people. They don't have, their mind is so not focused, and they don't kill enough children. But I can tell you that we see the social media very active. We see the education system in the Palestinian Authority that just a few days ago on television, official from the Palestinian Authority said, look at that school, we have 60 shaheeds, martyrs from this school. He didn't speak about the achievements of the students, he didn't say anything. He said he counted the shaheeds, the martyrs from school. So I think that they want to get the recognition, and in this age, thrilled and adventurous, I would do something, I will show my peer groups how I'm acting, I'll put my face on the wall or the letter the declaration that I'm going to be a shaheed, and and khalas in Arabic, it's like finish. This is the show, and the show is running.
So Israel has been faced with this moral dilemma. What do you do when you're dealing with a 14-year-old that's carrying out a terror attack against an innocent Israeli civilian? Right now we saw that the IDF actually just launched a new training program aimed at promoting non-lethal methods of confronting terrorists. How will this help Israel's ability to confront terror attacks from young people, if at all?
Natasha, the IDF, I served in the IDF 25 years. I can tell you this is the most moral army upon earth. We see that soldiers try not to shoot terrorists and to try to cope without casualties. But sometimes when a terrorist, even a 14-year-old boy, come and try to stab a female soldier or male soldier in the back, and they don't know if they have explosive belt on their body, they must, neutralize them. The other thing that I want to say, as a Knesset member, I actually promoted legislation against young minors terrorists. And we see that between the age of 12 and 14, you see a lot of children that use them, that the PA and others, incitement in the social media and television to carry out terror attacks. So in this age, they will be in a closed shelter, and after that, they will see if they can go to jail or not, to be able to prevent, because many times the terrorists actually use them as human shield and also abuse them in a way. You're a minor, go and stab a soldier, everything will be okay. The Israelis will feel sorry about you and you wouldn't go to jail. I interviewed youth like that, and they said, and after that, when we need to spend 20 years in jail, nobody comes even to visit us. So they just abused us.
Now, how is the Palestinian terror that's facing Israel right now different than what's happening in Europe? For example, we're seeing a rise in terror attacks in France, across Central Europe. Is there a difference? Is this related in any way?
I can see that I'm also a member, as a member of Knesset, head of delegation of OSCE. They're dealing with security staff, with the European parliamentarian, that they ignore and do not want to see the problem and do not want to define the problem. When they speak about foreign fighters, they don't speak about the jihadists. They don't say terrorists. They don't say Islamists. And I think that, let's say, we need to face it. A lot of Muslims are the first victims. Actually, most of the victims are Muslims. It's a fact. But many terrorists are Muslims, also Muslims. And we cannot ignore that. We have the Sunni version of ISIS, Daesh, and we have the Shia version of Hezbollah, Iran, and Assad, Alawite. So it's like we need to face it that we see right now a big, big war between the Sunni and the Shia, and also both of them against the West. And we see what's happening right now with Daesh. I think that it's just the tip of the iceberg. We see a lot of terror attacks, and I said it, just a month ago. I can tell you that from a Georgia conference, the last one that we have with the European parliamentarian, I spoke a few minutes and I told them, you need to define the enemy. You need to give a fight back. You cannot win this battle without that. And some of them agree with me, and some of them denied the problem and said, oh, we have Catholics that are terrorists, we have that and that. Excuse me, see what's happening with Daesh, this cruelty, how minors and antiquities and slaughtering people in the streets and killing people and killing and ruining cultures and history, like Palmyra, Tadmor. So I think that it's about time to say that to the Americans and also to the European. We have a big challenge, and we need to cope, to put the ego aside and to collaborate all the security forces and actually to increase the awareness of the people in the streets, that there is a problem. Be aware if you see something wrong. Be aware around you, and not to define like the terror attacks that Nidal Hassan carry out in Fort Hood, in Texas, Fort Hood unit, and they say, oh, it's a work violence, or this guy is crazy guy, and this he has a mental illness. No, not everybody is ill or had mental illness, and you see like a battalion of soldiers well equipped to fight this mentally ill, so-called mentally ill. Everybody know what is the problem, so go for it. Sure, not all the Muslims are terrorists, but they know, but we know that we should define it and fight it because it will be worse than now.
Well, it looks like it's going to have to be a global effort to combat what's now happening in Europe and obviously here in Israel. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Natasha. Thank you.
And now for our Hebrew word of the day. There's always a light at the end of the tunnel, especially if you're waiting for a train. So today's word is rakevet, which means train in Hebrew. Today, the Israeli public is devoted to its rakevet system because it's the fastest form of local transportation in Israel. In fact, it only takes 3.5 hours to travel by rakevet from one of the most northern points in Israel all the way to the southern Israeli desert. So if you're looking to make the most of your vacation here, get ready to ride the rakevet. As they say in Hebrew, al tefasfes et harakevet, or don't miss out on the train, aka the opportunity. But don't worry if that ends up happening, because if a train doesn't stop at your station, then it's probably not your train. Let's go ahead and take a look at the weather forecast. It's the beginning of a new week. Monday is expected to be partly cloudy with a high of 85 degrees. Tuesday should be sunny with a high of 84. All right, everybody, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.76 shekels to the American dollar. Remember to sign up for our daily newsletter at iltv.tv, and don't forget to check out our next update at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Thanks for watching, and see you tonight.